At 6:30 a.m. on the morning of June 6, 1944, a young German soldier named Heinrich Severloh crouched inside a concrete fortification overlooking a crescent of sand that the Americans would soon christen Omaha Beach. He was 20 years old, a farm boy from the flat agricultural lands of Lower Saxony. He had never pointed a weapon at another human being in his life. In the next 9 hours, that would change in ways that would haunt him until his final breath. The fortification was designated Widerstandsnest 62, one of 15 hardened defensive positions along this sector of what the Germans called the Atlantic Wall. Severloh had been stationed there for 3 months. He had helped excavate the trenches. He had strung the barbed wire across the approaches. He had positioned the machine guns that now pointed outward toward the gray waters of the English Channel. He knew every meter of the beach below his position. He knew precisely where the high tide line fell. He knew where the sand transitioned to exposed rock. He knew exactly where men attempting to cross that open ground would be forced to bunch together, clustering in the killing zones that his officers had so carefully plotted on their maps. Through the morning mist, Severloh watched the horizon fill with ships. First hundreds, then thousands. He had been told repeatedly that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable. He had been told that American soldiers were soft, undisciplined, wholly unprepared for the realities of modern warfare. He had been told many things by many confident voices. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Bernard Frerking, had gathered the men the night before to deliver what he clearly believed was essential instruction. If the invasion came, they must stop it on the beach. Not in the hedgerows behind them, not in the villages of the Norman interior, on the beach itself. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had proclaimed that the first 24 hours would decide everything. If the enemy established a foothold on French soil, Germany would lose the war. None of this preparation made the slightest difference when the moment actually arrived. What Heinrich Severloh witnessed that morning, and what he would spend the remaining decades of his life attempting to understand, was the beginning of a profound transformation in how German soldiers perceived their American enemy. A transformation that would convert dismissive contempt into bewildered confusion, that would evolve confusion into grudging professional respect, that would ultimately mature respect into something approaching genuine fear. This is not a story about military operations. This is a story about perception. This is a story about how an entire army of battle-hardened professional soldiers was forced to reconsider everything they believed about the men they were fighting. And it begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the sun-scorched deserts of North Africa, 18 months before D-Day. In February of 1943, the soldiers of the legendary Africa Corps had every reason for confidence in their own abilities. These men were veterans. They had spent 2 years fighting British and Commonwealth forces across the burning sands of Libya and Egypt. They had served under Erwin Rommel himself, the celebrated Desert Fox, whose tactical brilliance had become the stuff of military legend. They understood how to win. These soldiers had survived the furnace of desert warfare. They had learned to fight in sandstorms that reduced visibility to nothing. They had mastered the deadly art of armored combat across vast open expanses where a single tactical miscalculation meant death. They had besieged the fortress of Tobruk. They had clashed with British armor at El Alamein. They had pushed to within 60 miles of the Suez Canal. They considered themselves, with considerable justification, among the finest soldiers anywhere on earth. When word reached them that American troops had landed in Morocco and Algeria as part of Operation Torch in November 1942, the reaction among German soldiers ranged from amusement to open contempt. One lance corporal from the 15th Panzer Division wrote home to his family in mid-February 1943 with an assessment that was entirely typical of German attitudes at that moment. "We fought the armies a few days ago, using the German slang term for Americans, and destroyed over 90 of their tanks. We will blow him and all his rabble to perdition."
This attitude was not merely arrogance born from recent victories, it was rooted in deeply held beliefs about American society itself. German propaganda had spent years portraying the United States as a decadent nation, obsessed with money and material comfort, weakened by racial diversity, fundamentally incapable of producing real soldiers.
The prevailing view throughout the Wehrmacht was that Americans were enthusiastic amateurs playing at warfare, while German professionals did the serious fighting. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 seemed to confirm every assumption the Germans held. Rommel's forces tore through inexperienced American units with devastating efficiency, inflicting over 6,000 casualties. Approximately 300 Americans were killed outright. 3,000 more were wounded. Another 3,000 were captured and marched into captivity. American tanks burned in the Tunisian hill country. American infantry fled in disorder. American commanders lost all control of their scattered units. The problems plaguing the American force were real and numerous. Units had been dispersed across impossibly wide frontages without adequate coordination or mutual support. Communications collapsed repeatedly at critical moments. Some replacement troops had arrived at the front mere days before the battle began, many of them having never completed even basic training. One regiment received its first shipment of bazooka anti-tank weapons on February 12th and had to learn how to employ them against actual German armor just 2 days later. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding the American Second Corps, had positioned his forces in ways that practically invited disaster. Units were scattered across a 30-mile front. Task forces were fragmented beyond the ability to support one another. When the German assault came crashing down upon them, American formations were defeated in detail, destroyed one isolated piece at a time. German tank crews spoke of the Tunisian fighting with something approaching pure joy. After years of facing the methodical, well-supplied British Army, they found American units disorganized and easily panicked. Panzers rolled through American defensive positions that should have held firm. Infantry scattered before German pressure that would not have broken more experienced troops. Officers lost contact with their men in the confusion. Rommel himself initially shared his soldiers' dismissive assessment. He had studied the American positions through his field glasses. He had noted the scattered, vulnerable deployment of their forces. He had identified what he called fundamental weaknesses in their tactical thinking. The Americans, he believed with professional certainty, were years away from becoming competent soldiers. But something unexpected happened during those 5 days at Kasserine Pass. Something that planted the first seed of doubt in German minds about their comfortable assessment of American fighting capability. On the 4th day of the battle, American resistance suddenly stiffened. Artillery fire, which had been sporadic and poorly coordinated during the initial chaos, suddenly became devastatingly accurate. Infantry units that had broken under the first German assault reformed themselves and launched aggressive counterattacks. The withdrawal that Rommel had confidently expected to become a complete rout instead transformed into an organized fighting retreat. By February 22nd, Rommel made a decision that surprised his own staff officers. He ordered a withdrawal, not because his forces had been defeated, they had not been, but because the Americans were no longer behaving like the beaten enemy he had anticipated. In his personal papers, Rommel later recorded his revised professional assessment. The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class, he wrote. They had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and soon succeeded in damming up our advance. That phrase would become a recurring theme in German assessments of American forces for the remainder of the war. Recovered very quickly. The Germans had expected the Americans to break completely. Instead, they bent under pressure and bounced back.
What Rommel and his officers could not observe was the machinery of change already grinding into motion behind American lines. Within weeks of the Kasserine debacle, heads began to roll throughout the American command structure. General Fredendall was relieved of command and replaced by George S. Patton, a vastly different kind of military leader. Omar Bradley arrived as Assistant Corps Commander. The entire organizational structure was reorganized from top to bottom. More importantly, the American Army learned. Officers who had witnessed the disaster analyzed precisely what had gone wrong. They implemented corrections immediately. Units that had been scattered were consolidated into coherent formations. Training programs were intensified dramatically. Communication procedures were completely overhauled. Artillery coordination, which had been almost non-existent, became a command priority. The speed of this institutional adaptation shocked German commanders who expected the Americans to require months or even years to digest their painful lessons. Instead, visible improvements appeared within weeks. At the Battle of El Guitar in late March 1943, just 5 weeks after the humiliation at Kasserine, American forces faced another determined German attack. This time, they held their ground.
American artillery shattered German armored columns. American infantry stood firm under pressure that would have broken them weeks earlier. The Germans withdrew, having accomplished nothing. This pattern of rapid learning would come to define the American military experience throughout the Second World War. Unlike armies built upon long traditions and rigid doctrines, the Americans proved willing to discard methods that did not work and adopt new approaches that did. They learned from the British. They learned from the Germans themselves. Most importantly, they learned from their own mistakes, and they learned with a speed that caught their enemies completely off guard. The German army in Tunisia was eventually trapped between American forces advancing from the west and British forces pressing from the east. On May 13, 1943, the remnants of the once proud Africa Corps surrendered, along with over 260,000 Axis troops. It was a catastrophe for Germany, second only to the frozen disaster at Stalingrad. Among those marching into captivity were many of the veterans who had mocked American soldiers just 3 months earlier. But the full implications of what this transformation meant would not become clear until the summer of 1944, until Normandy, until men like Heinrich Severloh saw with their own eyes what American industrial power and American determination could actually accomplish. The morning of June 6, 1944, destroyed everything the German soldier thought he understood about fighting Americans. Severloh was positioned in Widerstandsnest 62, a fortified resistance nest overlooking what the Allied planners had designated Omaha Beach. He manned an MG-42 machine gun with a clear field of fire across several hundred meters of open sand. Below his position, the first waves of American infantry would have to cross that killing ground directly under his guns. When the landing craft materialized through the morning fog, Severloh opened fire. He did not stop for hours. The weapon in his hands was an MG-42, one of the most lethal machine guns ever designed. It fired at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that individual shots blurred together into a continuous tearing roar the German soldiers nicknamed Hitler's Bawsaw. Below him, American soldiers had to cross several hundred meters of completely open sand while fully exposed to this withering fire. There was no cover, there was no concealment, just sand and surf and the slow dying of men who had nowhere to hide. Severloh later estimated that he fired over 12,000 rounds that morning. He burned through multiple barrels as they overheated from the sustained fire. He kept shooting until his hands were blistered and his ears rang, and the acrid smell of burnt propellant filled the concrete bunker. He fired until he exhausted his machine gun ammunition and switched to a rifle.
He fired until the Americans finally broke through the German defenses and forced him to abandon his position. What happened on that beach has been described in countless histories from the Allied perspective, but the German view reveals something different from the American accounts of heroism and sacrifice. From behind his machine gun, Severloh watched wave after wave of American soldiers fall on the sand below. He watched their bodies pile up at the waterline. He watched the incoming tide push the corpses higher on the beach. And he watched something else entirely. He watched them keep coming. This was the detail that German soldiers across the Normandy front reported with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. The Americans did not stop. Landing craft were destroyed by German fire, and more appeared behind them. Men were cut down on the sand, and fresh soldiers ran forward to take their places. Entire units were annihilated, and fresh formations landed to continue the assault. A German wireless operator assigned to a bunker near Severloh's described what he experienced during those chaotic hours. On that night of June 6th, none of us expected the invasion anymore. There was a strong wind and thick cloud cover. But then, in the night, the air was suddenly full of innumerable aircraft. We thought, what are they demolishing tonight? But then it started. One message followed another. Paratroopers landing here, gliders landing there. Finally, landing craft approaching. In the morning, a huge naval force was sighted. That was the last report the advanced observation posts could send before they were overwhelmed. And it was the last report we received about the situation. It was no longer possible to get any idea of what was happening. Wireless communications were jammed, cables were cut. Officers completely lost grasp of the tactical situation. When this soldier was eventually captured and saw the full scale of what the Allies had assembled, his reaction summarized what thousands of German prisoners felt. At first, I was rather depressed, of course. I, an old soldier, a prisoner of war after only a few hours of the invasion. But when I saw the material assembled behind the enemy front, I could only say, "Old man, how lucky you have been."
A German officer from the 352nd Infantry Division, which defended the sector adjacent to Severloh's position, later described the psychological impact of what he witnessed. "We had been told the Americans were poor soldiers," he said. "We were told they would not fight. But they came across that beach directly into our guns. They kept coming. We killed them, and still they came. No soldier who experienced that could maintain contempt for such an enemy." The physical scale of the invasion compounded the psychological shock that German defenders experienced. They looked out at the English Channel and saw an armada that defied human comprehension. One captured German soldier marched past supply dumps that had been established on the beach within hours of the initial landing, reportedly made an observation that became famous among Allied logistics officers. "I know how you defeated us," he said. "You piled up the supplies and then let them fall on us." He was more accurate than he realized. The war in Europe was what the Germans called a Materialschlacht, a battle of material, and the Americans waged this battle on a scale that German industry could barely imagine. Within 48 hours of the initial landings, more than 130,000 troops had come ashore. Within a week, over 300,000 Allied soldiers stood on French soil. The Allies had constructed artificial harbors from prefabricated components that had been manufactured in England and towed across the Channel. They had created a functioning port where no port had ever existed. German officers who had studied the logistical impossibility of supplying an invasion force across open beaches now watched the impossible becoming reality before their eyes. These artificial harbors, codenamed mulberries, were engineering marvels that German planners had never anticipated. The Allies had deliberately sunk old ships to create breakwaters against the Channel storms. They had floated massive concrete caissons across the water. They had assembled pontoon bridges and piers that could rise and fall with the tides. A complete working port had appeared on the French coast over the space of mere days.
German officers who had fought campaigns from France to North Africa to Russia, who had studied the logistical calculations that had doomed Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of Britain, looked at these artificial harbors and understood they were fighting something unprecedented. How do you defeat such an enemy? How can you possibly win? There was no more stopping the Allied advance than stopping the weather itself. What was coming was not merely an army, it was a force of nature. There had been no port from which to sustain a major offensive, so the Allies had simply manufactured one from sand and steel. The comparison with German logistics was stark and demoralizing. The Wehrmacht remained heavily dependent on horses for transport in 1944. Their motor pool was a cobbled-together collection of German, Italian, captured French, and captured British vehicles, each type requiring different spare parts that were chronically unavailable. German soldiers frequently went hungry, while the Americans seemed to possess unlimited quantities of food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment. Capturing an American supply depot was like discovering a gold mine. German soldiers who overran American positions were astonished by the abundance waiting for them. Everything a fighting man could possibly need was organized and readily available. Rations that included chocolate and cigarettes, medical supplies in quantities German medics could only dream of, spare parts, fuel. The contrast with German deprivation was deeply demoralizing. The German experience at Normandy forced a fundamental reassessment of American military capability. But it was not merely the material abundance that impressed German soldiers. It was how the Americans fought once they got off those beaches. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, American infantry tactics evolved with a speed that genuinely alarmed German commanders. Units that had performed poorly during the initial days adapted their methods within weeks. They developed new techniques for clearing the dense bocage. They integrated tanks, infantry, and engineers into combined arms teams. They learned to call in devastating artillery and close air support with remarkable coordination. The bocage was terrain ideally suited for defensive warfare. Ancient hedgerows, some of them centuries old, divided the Norman countryside into thousands of small enclosed fields. Each hedgerow sat atop an earthen embankment thick enough to stop a tank. The vegetation was dense enough to conceal machine gun positions until the enemy was practically on top of them. Every single field became a potential killing ground. German forces exploited this terrain with expert skill. They had dug in deep. They had established interlocking fields of fire. They were prepared to bleed the Americans for every meter of ground. In the early days, after the beach landings, this defensive strategy worked exactly as planned. American units suffered heavy casualties attempting to push through the hedgerows using tactics designed for more open terrain. But then the Americans adapted.
Someone, and the exact origin remains historically disputed, conceived the idea of welding steel teeth onto the front of Sherman tanks. These improvised cutting devices, fashioned from German beach obstacles that had been intended to stop the invasion, allowed American tanks to slice directly through the hedgerow embankments rather than climbing over them and exposing their vulnerable undersides to German anti-tank weapons. Within weeks, thousands of American tanks had been modified with these so-called rhino attachments. Infantry tactics evolved simultaneously alongside the equipment improvements. Small unit leaders developed techniques for coordinated assaults against hedgerow positions. Artillery forward observers perfected methods for calling accurate fire onto concealed German positions. Engineers blasted gaps through the embankments for armor to exploit. Tactical air controllers learned to work aircraft strikes closer to friendly troops without causing friendly fire casualties. The Germans watched this rapid evolution with growing alarm. They were accustomed to fighting enemies who required months to adjust their methods. The British, in particular, had proven slow to change established procedures. The Americans changed in days. Ideas flowed upward from privates and sergeants to colonels and generals.
Solutions that worked in one unit were immediately shared across the entire force. The army seemed to learn as a single living organism. Field Marshal Rommel, now commanding the defense of Normandy, noted this adaptation with professional concern. The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, has broken the front open. Also in evidence is their great superiority in ammunition supply. The American artillery system was unlike anything the Germans had faced in any previous campaign. It was not merely the number of guns, though those numbers were formidable. It was the sophistication of how those guns were employed. American fire direction centers could coordinate multiple batteries to fire simultaneously on a single target in what were called time-on-target missions. All the shells would arrive at precisely the same moment, giving enemy soldiers no warning to take cover. German veterans spoke of American artillery with something approaching reverence. The accuracy was stunning, the volume was overwhelming, and the fire seemed to arrive everywhere, all the time, without end. One German officer described lying in a trench while American shells fell continuously for hours. He was unable to move, unable to fight back, simply waiting for the barrage to end or for a shell to find him. The small Piper Cub observation aircraft that American artillery battalions used became symbols of impending doom. German soldiers learned that if they could see one of those fragile little aircraft circling overhead, their position had been spotted and artillery fire was imminent. The Germans called these spotter planes their most hated enemies, more feared even than tanks or infantry. Air power compounded the artillery advantage to a degree that paralyzed German operations. American fighter bombers roamed freely behind German lines, attacking anything that moved. Truck convoys were destroyed on the roads. Trains were strafed in their stations. Individual soldiers learned to freeze at the sound of aircraft engines, knowing that any movement might draw a devastating attack. German reinforcements moving toward Normandy had to travel exclusively at night and remain hidden during daylight hours. Units that should have reached the front in hours took days. Fuel and ammunition that should have resupplied frontline troops was destroyed before it could arrive. The Germans found themselves fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, while the Americans seemed to possess unlimited resources. But what truly transformed German perceptions was not American firepower alone. It was American aggression. German veterans who had fought against the British, the French, and the Soviets reported something distinctive about American combat behavior. One former Wehrmacht soldier interviewed after the war described it with professional precision. The British were competent and professional, but slow. They would only attack with absolutely overwhelming force. The Russians were capable soldiers, but their tactics were often crude. The Americans were different. What struck German soldiers most forcefully was the American response to combat. If there was something different between Americans and the other European allies, it was how they reacted to an attack. The other allies would immediately return fire and edge their way toward a more favorable position. The Americans would immediately return fire, bring a punishing rain of artillery or air power down on top of whatever they were fighting, and move to counterattack as soon as the bombardment ended.
German veterans described this combination of overwhelming firepower and relentless forward momentum as unlike anything they had experienced on other fronts. This aggressiveness consistently caught German forces off guard. They were accustomed to measured responses from enemies who would consolidate their gains before pressing forward. The Americans pressed forward immediately. They accepted casualty levels that would have caused other armies to pause for reorganization, and they kept attacking regardless. German veterans compared this to nothing they had previously experienced. The British attacked methodically, with careful preparation and overwhelming force, but they would also stop to reorganize after achieving an objective. The Soviets attacked with mass and apparent disregard for casualties, but often without tactical sophistication.
The Americans combined the aggression of the Soviets with the organization of the British and added their own distinctive willingness to improvise solutions on the spot. German veterans who survived the Normandy campaign consistently described American tactics as relentless. The tempo of operations never let up. Before defenders could recover from one assault, another would hit them from a different direction. Losses that would have stalled other forces seemed only to fuel American determination. It was exhausting simply trying to survive against such constant pressure. This tempo, maintained day after day and week after week, wore German defenders down to nothing. Units that had started at full strength were ground into shadows of their former selves. Officers who had survived years of fighting were killed or wounded. The relentless pressure, combined with overwhelming firepower and endless supplies, created conditions under which effective defense became impossible. At the same time, German soldiers noted a contradiction that genuinely confused them. These same aggressive fighters treated prisoners and civilians with a consideration that seemed incompatible with their ferocity and combat. German propaganda had warned soldiers to expect brutality from the Americans. Instead, captured Germans frequently found themselves offered cigarettes, chocolate bars, and prompt medical treatment. The contrast between expectation and reality left many prisoners stunned. They had been told Americans would be cruel and vengeful. Instead, they found captors who followed the Geneva Convention, provided medical care to wounded prisoners, and treated captured soldiers with a dignity that many had not expected from any enemy. German officers who became prisoners noted the informal relationships between American officers and their enlisted men. The lack of rigid hierarchy surprised them. American officers ate with their soldiers, joked with them, treated them as colleagues rather than subordinates. This informality, which German military culture would have considered a dangerous weakness, seemed instead to produce soldiers who fought with initiative and personal determination. This combination of combat ferocity and humane treatment created genuine cognitive dissonance for German soldiers. The enemy was simultaneously more aggressive in battle and more civilized in victory than anyone had expected. The propaganda image of the soft, decadent American had collided with reality. Reality won. By December 1944, German forces in the West had been pushed back to their own borders. Adolf Hitler, desperate to reverse the tide, gathered his remaining reserves for one final offensive. Operation Wacht am Rhein would strike through the Ardennes forest, the same route German forces had used to defeat France in 1940. The goal was audacious: split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, force the Western Allies to negotiate a peace that would allow Germany to survive. The Battle of the Bulge would become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army, and it would provide the final conclusive proof of how completely German perceptions of American soldiers had been transformed. The offensive was Hitler's personal gamble. Against the advice of his most experienced generals, he had gathered virtually every reserve the Wehrmacht could scrape together. 3 full armies, over 200,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks. German commanders were deeply skeptical. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model both believed the plan was too ambitious given available resources. Model reportedly told subordinates that the operation had no more than a 10% chance of success. But Hitler would hear no objections. The attack would proceed. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops with nearly 1,000 armored vehicles launched a surprise offensive against American positions thinly spread across 85 miles of the Ardennes forest. The timing was deliberate. Hitler had specifically waited for weather conditions that would ground Allied aircraft. Heavy fog and driving snow blanketed the region, neutralizing the air superiority that had devastated German forces in Normandy. The initial assault achieved complete tactical surprise. American units, many of them either inexperienced or exhausted from previous fighting, were overwhelmed. In some sectors, German forces advanced 50 miles in the first few days. The surprise was total. Allied intelligence had completely failed to detect the massive German buildup. Commanders who should have been alert to the possibility of attack had convinced themselves the war was nearly won. The Ardennes sector was considered a quiet area, a place to rest weary divisions and train new ones. Some American soldiers had grown so complacent they called it the Ghost Front. German forces exploited this complacency ruthlessly. Specially trained commandos wearing American uniforms infiltrated behind Allied lines to spread maximum confusion. They changed road signs, they cut communications wires, they spread false rumors about German breakthroughs.
American security procedures collapsed into chaos as soldiers tried to distinguish genuine Americans from German infiltrators by asking questions about baseball statistics and state capitals. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the old German assessment might be vindicated after all. American units broke under the pressure. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. The most inexperienced division in the theater, the 106th Infantry, lost 2 entire regiments, over 7,000 men in one of the largest mass surrenders in American military history. But then something happened. Something that crystallized everything German soldiers had learned about their American enemy over the previous 2 years. American forces defending the critical crossroads town of Bastogne refused to retreat. Surrounded by German forces demanding their surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe sent back a one-word reply that would become legendary: nuts. That single word communicated something the Germans had come to understand through bitter experience. The Americans would not break. They would not quit. They could be killed, but they could not be made to stop fighting. The defense of Bastogne became one of the legendary stands in American military history. The town sat at the junction of 7 roads, making it essential for German logistics. Without Bastogne, the offensive could not be sustained, so the Germans surrounded the town and demanded surrender. The Americans refused. Inside the perimeter, conditions were desperate. The 101st Airborne Division, which had been rushed to Bastogne, was critically low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Wounded men lay in makeshift hospitals without adequate care. The weather was brutal, with temperatures well below freezing and snow falling constantly. German forces surrounded the town completely, yet the defenders held. When German attacks probed the perimeter, American paratroopers threw them back. When ammunition ran low, soldiers scavenged from the dead and captured enemy weapons. When artillery support seemed impossible, forward observers found creative ways to call in fire from guns that should not have been able to reach. The defense was resourceful, determined, and utterly stubborn. On December 26th, elements of General George Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne. The relief force had traveled over 150 miles in brutal winter conditions, fighting through German resistance the entire way. Patton had wheeled his entire army 90 degrees and attacked northward in a matter of days. Military historians consider this movement one of the most remarkable achievements of American logistics and leadership in the entire war. At the critical road junction of St. Vith, American armored forces held out for 6 days against overwhelming odds, buying invaluable time for Allied forces to organize a coherent response. Small units of engineers and infantry delayed German spearheads by defending crossroads they had no realistic hope of holding. Soldiers burned or relocated critical gasoline stocks to deny them to German tanks that were desperately short of fuel. The speed and accuracy with which American artillery responded to the offensive astonished German commanders. Units that had been in complete disarray 48 hours earlier were suddenly delivering coordinated fire that shattered German formations. At Elsenborn Ridge in the northern sector of the Bulge, American forces massed nearly 350 artillery pieces and created what German soldiers described as a wall of steel. The 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite formation, literally ran into this wall. Their advance stopped cold.
When the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, American air power entered the battle. The impact was devastating. German tanks, trucks, and infantry that had been moving freely under cloud cover were suddenly exposed to relentless attack from above. Fuel supplies that were already critically short were destroyed on the roads. The offensive, which depended entirely on speed and momentum, ground to a halt. Fighter bombers appeared in waves. P-47 Thunderbolts carrying bombs and rockets attacked German armored columns. C-47 transports dropped supplies to besieged Bastogne. Medium bombers struck German supply depots and rail lines. The sky, which had protected the German advance for days, became their enemy. German soldiers who had experienced the full weight of Allied air power in Normandy recognized immediately what this meant. The window of opportunity was closing forever. Without fuel, tanks became steel coffins. Without ammunition, artillery fell silent. Without supplies, men starved and froze. The fuel shortage became catastrophic. German tanks, the heart of the offensive, could not move. Some crews drained fuel from one vehicle to enable another to advance a few more miles. Others abandoned their machines entirely, unable to refuel them. The 116th Panzer Division finished the battle without a single operational tank, simply because there was no fuel to run them.
By mid-January 1945, the Bulge had been completely eliminated. German losses exceeded 100,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. More importantly, the Wehrmacht had expended its last strategic reserves. There would be no more offensives, no more counterattacks, only retreat. The human cost was staggering on both sides. American casualties exceeded 80,000, including over 19,000 killed. It was the costliest single battle in American military history. But while American losses could be replaced, German losses could not. The men, the tanks, the fuel, the ammunition expended in the Ardennes represented resources Germany could never recover. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the Battle of the Bulge undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. German soldiers who survived it came away with a different kind of assessment. They had witnessed an army that could absorb a devastating surprise attack, stabilize its lines, and counterattack with overwhelming force, all within the span of a few weeks. When one German armored commander was asked what he thought of the American soldier now, his answer was brief. "What is the point in this? I have a wife and children." The question contained its own answer. Against an enemy with unlimited resources, unlimited determination, and the demonstrated ability to recover from any setback, continued resistance had become futile. By spring 1945, German soldiers were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Over 317,000 were captured in the Ruhr pocket alone, twice what American intelligence had estimated. Many German soldiers actively sought out American units to surrender to, preferring American captivity to falling into Soviet hands. The Ruhr pocket was the death knell of the Wehrmacht in the West. American and British forces had encircled Germany's industrial heartland, trapping nearly 350,000 Axis troops. Day after day, American loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals. Day after day, the pocket shrank as German units ran out of food, ammunition, and hope. German soldiers made their decisions based on what they had learned about their enemy. Those on the Eastern Front understood what capture by the Soviets would mean. The atrocities committed by German forces in Russia were being repaid with interest. But capture by Americans was different. Word had spread throughout the Wehrmacht that Americans treated prisoners according to the Geneva Convention. They provided food and medical care. They did not execute surrendering soldiers. This knowledge shaped German behavior as the Reich collapsed. Units fought desperately to escape westward so they could surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. Soldiers discarded their weapons and walked toward American lines with raised hands. Officers negotiated surrenders for entire divisions.
The contrast with the Eastern Front could not have been more stark. Against the Soviets, German soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew capture meant death or the Gulag. Against the Americans, surrender became a rational choice. Better to spend the war in an American prison camp than to die in a hopeless battle. One German soldier, asked why he had surrendered so readily, gave an answer that captured the transformed German view of the American enemy. The Germans should have thought of some of these things before they began the war, particularly before attacking the Russians. But when given a choice between captors, he was glad to surrender to the Americans. In 2017, a German man named Günther Grave, then 91 years old, rode an electric bicycle onto Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington state. He had made this journey to say thank you. Grave had been captured in Normandy in August 1944, wounded by a grenade at age 18. He was transported to a prisoner of war camp at what is now Joint Base Lewis McChord. What he experienced there defied everything he had been told about Americans. Instead of brutality, he found ice cream and Coca-Cola. Instead of forced labor and starvation, he found work that paid 80 cents a day and food more abundant than anything available in wartime Germany. He later wrote about standing in front of a canteen in the prisoner camp, trying to decide whether to buy ice cream or Coca-Cola, and suddenly realizing how incredibly fortunate he had been to be captured by the Americans rather than the Russians. Grave was not unique. Across the United States, German prisoners of war were held in camps that many remembered as the most comfortable period of their entire wartime experience. They worked on farms. They learned English. Some formed friendships with American guards and local civilians that lasted the rest of their lives. There were over 400 prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States during the war, holding nearly 400,000 German prisoners at the peak. The camps became small German communities in the American heartland. Prisoners produced newspapers in German. They organized orchestras and theater groups. They played soccer on fields surrounded by barbed wire. Many American farmers came to rely on German prisoner labor. The prisoners harvested crops, cleared land, and performed agricultural work that American men who had gone off to war could no longer do. Some farmers developed genuine respect for the work ethic of their German laborers.
Some Germans were astonished to discover that the American hatred they had been led to expect simply did not exist. The treatment was not perfect. Conditions varied from camp to camp. Some prisoners faced hostility, some suffered abuse. But compared to what prisoners of war experienced elsewhere in the world, including what prisoners held by Germany experienced, American POW camps were remarkably humane. Food was plentiful. German prisoners ate the same rations as American soldiers. Medical care was provided. Work was often hard but not punishing. Education programs were available. Religious services were permitted. The contrast with the starvation, brutality, and murder that characterized German POW camps for Soviet prisoners was absolute. Some German prisoners actually gained weight during their captivity. This detail, trivial in itself, became symbolic of the American approach. The Americans had resources to spare. They could afford to treat even their enemies well. This abundance was itself a demonstration of national power that impressed German prisoners far more than any propaganda ever could. This treatment created a lasting impression that persisted long after the war ended. German veterans who had fought against Americans often spoke of their former enemy with a respect that surprised younger generations. They had expected monsters and found human beings. They had expected barbarity and found a strange combination of overwhelming violence in battle and genuine decency in victory. Heinrich Severloh, the machine gunner from Omaha Beach, survived the war. He returned to farming in Lower Saxony and tried to forget what he had done on June 6, 1944. But the memories would not leave him. For years, Severloh told no one about his experience on the beach.
He went about his life. He married. He raised a family. He worked the land. But at night, the images returned. The landing craft emerging from the fog, the soldiers running through the surf, the bodies piling up on the sand, the endless firing. In 1959, Severloh encountered a series of magazine articles about D-Day written by journalist Paul Carrel. Reading through the accounts, he noticed something strange. None of them mentioned the section of beach he had defended. The position that he knew had inflicted devastating casualties on the American assault had simply been left out of the story. Severloh contacted Carrel, who recognized him as an invaluable witness. Through the journalist's connections, Severloh was able to contact other veterans who had defended the same sector. Together, they pieced together what had happened that morning. In 1963, Severloh returned to Normandy for the first time since the war. He visited the American cemetery overlooking the beach where he had fired his machine gun. He walked among the white crosses marking the graves of men he may have killed, and he wept. The cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer holds the remains of over 9,000 American servicemen, most of them killed during the invasion of Normandy. The white crosses and stars of David stretch across manicured lawns overlooking the very beaches where these men fell. For Severloh, walking among those graves meant confronting the human cost of his actions in a way that could not be avoided or minimized. Later, through the efforts of historians, Severloh was connected with an American veteran named David Silva, who had been wounded on that same beach. The two men met in Normandy in 2004, 40 years after the battle. They embraced. They wept together. They spent 4 days filming, reliving the events that had brought them together. Before they parted, both men agreed this would be their last trip to Normandy. It was their way of ensuring they would never have to say goodbye again. Severloh died in 2006. Silva followed in 2010. The transformation in how German soldiers viewed American troops between 1943 and 1945 was profound and complete. It moved from dismissive contempt to professional respect to something approaching awe. At Kasserine Pass, German veterans expected a quick victory against soft amateurs. By the end of the Bulge, they had learned that American forces could absorb catastrophic setbacks and emerge stronger than before. They had witnessed an industrial capacity that could supply endless replacements of men and materiel. They had experienced artillery and air power so overwhelming that individual courage and tactical skill became irrelevant. But perhaps the most important lesson German soldiers took from their experience fighting Americans was also the most surprising. The enemy they had been taught to despise as weak and decadent proved not only militarily formidable, but also, in victory, remarkably humane. Field Marshal Rommel, who had first encountered American forces at Kasserine, came to embody this changed perspective. His initial dismissiveness had transformed into genuine professional respect. The enemy he had once expected to crush in weeks had instead improved relentlessly, learned from every defeat, and never stopped advancing. In 2001, German historian Sönke Neitzel discovered a remarkable archive in the British National Archives. Hidden in recently declassified files were thousands of pages of transcripts containing secretly recorded conversations between German prisoners of war. These men had spoken freely, believing their conversations were private, revealing their true thoughts about the war, about their enemy, about what they had experienced.
The discovery was extraordinary. During the war, British and American intelligence had installed hidden microphones in prisoner-of-war camps. The original intent was to gather military intelligence about German weapons, tactics, and dispositions. But the recordings captured far more than that. They captured German soldiers talking to each other, as only soldiers do, without the filter of propaganda or the need to maintain morale. Neitzel eventually located additional transcripts at the National Archives in Washington, over 150,000 pages in total. The recordings covered soldiers from all branches of the German military, from privates to generals, from early captures to late surrenders. Together, they provided an unprecedented window into the German soldiers' unguarded thoughts. In these private conversations, soldiers talked freely about their hopes and fears, their concerns, their daily lives, with a banality that can appear shocking to modern readers. They also discussed the horrors of war, violence, and death, and repeatedly they talked about the enemy they faced. In those recordings, German soldiers discussed the Americans with a frankness impossible in official channels. They talked about the overwhelming firepower they had faced. They talked about the relentless American aggression in combat. And repeatedly, they expressed a grudging respect for an enemy they had expected to despise. The recordings revealed that German soldiers generally respected the British and Americans, but not the Soviets. They spoke of American material abundance with a mixture of envy and despair. They discussed American tactics with professional analysis, and they acknowledged, in words they would never have put in a letter home, that the enemy they had been taught to underestimate was anything but weak. One recorded conversation captured the evolution in German thinking perfectly. A veteran explained to a newer prisoner that the Americans were not what propaganda had promised. They were not soft. They were not cowardly. They combined overwhelming material resources with an aggressiveness in combat that had caught German forces completely off guard. The professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht had expected amateurs playing at war. Instead, they found an enemy who learned faster, adapted more readily, and never stopped pressing forward. The German experience of American soldiers in World War II offers a lesson that extends far beyond military history. It is a lesson about the danger of underestimating an enemy based on cultural assumptions. It is a lesson about the gap between propaganda and reality. And it is a lesson about how quickly confident contempt can transform into fearful respect when confronted with evidence that contradicts cherished beliefs. German military culture in the 1930s and 40s placed enormous emphasis on warrior tradition. The Wehrmacht saw itself as the inheritor of Prussian military excellence, heirs to Frederick the Great and the victories of 1870 and 1914. They had been trained to believe that German military prowess was unmatched, that their professionalism and discipline would overcome any numerical disadvantage. The United States, by contrast, seemed the opposite of everything the German military valued. American society was diverse and democratic. American military traditions were short and, in German eyes, unimpressive. American soldiers were civilians in uniform, not professional warriors.
The assumption that such men could never match German soldiers in combat seemed almost self-evident. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Americans learned faster than the Germans ever expected. They adapted more readily than any opponent the Wehrmacht had faced. They absorbed casualties that would have broken other armies and kept fighting. They brought industrial resources to bear on a scale that made German efforts seem primitive by comparison. By 1945, the Wehrmacht had learned to fear the enemy they had once mocked. Not because American soldiers were individually superior, though many proved themselves excellent fighting men, but because the American system, the combination of resources, flexibility, aggression, and determination, created a fighting force that could not be stopped. The German soldiers who faced Americans between 1943 and 1945 learned that lesson through bitter experience. They paid for it in blood. By the end, the Wehrmacht had lost nearly 600,000 men and prisoners in the West alone, most of them to American forces.
When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, over 1 million American soldiers stood on German soil. They had crossed an ocean. They had broken through the Atlantic Wall. They had fought through the hedgerows and forests and mountains of Western Europe. They had defeated an enemy that had conquered most of a continent. The journey from Kasserine to Berlin had taken just over 2 years. In that time, the American Army had transformed from an inexperienced force that could be routed by veteran German units into a juggernaut that crushed everything in its path. The German soldiers who witnessed this transformation carried their memories for the rest of their lives. Some, like Günter Graue, came to feel gratitude toward their former enemy. Others, like Heinrich Severloh, carried guilt and sorrow that never fully healed. All of them had been forced to abandon the comfortable certainties of propaganda and confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans were not what they had been told. They were something far more formidable. And by the time German soldiers understood this, it was far too late. That is the lesson that emerges from the German experience of American soldiers in World War II. Perceptions formed in ignorance can persist only until they collide with reality. And when that collision occurs, the awakening is often brutal, final, and irreversible. The veterans who survived that collision on both sides spent the rest of their lives processing what they had experienced. Some found reconciliation, like Severloh and Silva meeting 60 years after trying to kill each other. Some found peace, like Graue riding his bicycle across an ocean to say thank you. Some never recovered, haunted by memories that no amount of time could diminish. But all of them, German and American alike, understood something that can only be learned through direct experience. They knew what war truly costs. They knew what human beings are capable of, both the worst and the best. And they knew that the enemy they had been taught to hate was in the end made of the same flesh and blood and hopes and fears as themselves. If you found this exploration of history compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more of these untold perspectives from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these hidden stories from history. Each one deserves to be remembered. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts, and you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.